Aldo Moro. 30 years ago, the far-left faction and a group known as the Red Brigades savagely murdered the prominent politician and former prime minister of the country after a 55-day captivity. This bloody event, which occurred on the 9th of May, 1978, was not merely a political assassination, but rather a deep wound inflicted upon the very heart of Italian democracy. Moro, who was one of the architects of political stability in the post-World War II era, was, in March of that same year, kidnapped in a meticulously planned armed operation, which resulted in the deaths of 5 of his bodyguards. The kidnappers, who sought the release of their imprisoned members, hid him in a secret, unknown location. The government of the time, led by Giulio Andreotti, despite the desperate pleas of Moro's family and some political factions, refused any form of negotiation or compromise, adhering strictly to a strategy of no surrender. Finally, the body of Aldo Moro was discovered in the trunk of a car, in the very center of Rome. Klaas. On an October night in 1993, 3 young girls had gathered for a sleepover. An armed intruder, later identified, forced his way into the home, tied up Klaas's friends, and kidnapped her right before their terrified eyes. This shocking event rapidly evolved into a national phenomenon. The media provided extensive coverage, and thousands of volunteers joined the massive search efforts. Even prominent figures like Winona Ryder, who was originally from the area, participated in the attempt to find her, offering a substantial reward. Unfortunately, these efforts culminated in a tragic outcome. The kidnapper, identified as Richard Allen Davis, was apprehended and subsequently led agents to a remote location in Sonoma County, where Polly's body was discovered. Throughout his sentencing, he displayed not a single sign of remorse. Christopher Abeyta. In July of 1986, a horrific tragedy struck the Abeyta family in Colorado Springs. Christopher, the family's 7-month-old baby, was mysteriously taken from his crib on a quiet night. When his mother awoke, she was met with a nightmarish scene: an empty crib and the front door left standing slightly ajar. The infant's father immediately identified the prime suspect as a woman named Emma Bradshaw, someone he had recently ended a relationship with and who had a history of breaking into their home. However, there was never enough evidence to formally charge her, and she was never officially named a suspect. This case became one of the most heartbreaking unsolved abduction cases in American history. Extensive nationwide searches and the family's relentless efforts yielded no results. Years passed and Christopher's parents never found any answers. Ultimately, both of them passed away, consumed by a deep and unresolved grief. Emmett Till. In August of 1955, a horrific crime in Mississippi shook the nation's conscience. Emmett Till, a black teenager who was visiting relatives in the town of Money, was accused of a minor and unproven offense which led to his brutal death. He was abducted from his relative's home by Roy Bryant and his half-brother, J.W. Milam. These 2 men subjected Emmett to savage torture, shot him, and then threw his body into the Tallahatchie River, weighted down by a metal weight. When his mutilated body was recovered from the water, Emmett's mother, Mamie Till Mobley, made a courageous decision. She held an open casket funeral, allowing the world to witness the brutal consequences of racial hatred firsthand. The photographs of her son's disfigured body ignited public outrage and became a catalyst for the civil rights movement. Yet, the justice system of that time failed utterly. The murderers were acquitted by an all-white jury. The tragedy of Emmett Till became a painful symbol of racial injustice and a pivotal turning point in the fight for equality in America. The Princes in the Tower. In 15th century England, the stage was set for one of the country's most enduring historical mysteries. In 1483, the young King Edward V and his younger brother Richard were imprisoned in the Tower of London on the orders of their ambitious uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. This move was made under the pretext of preparing for Edward's coronation. The Duke, having sidelined his nephews, then claimed the throne for himself, becoming King Richard III. From that moment onward, the young princes vanished from public view forever, their fate never to be known. Accusations of their murder immediately fell upon the new king, an allegation that has persisted throughout history. Centuries later, in 1674, the discovery of 2 small skeletons beneath a staircase in the tower revived these speculations. Yet their identities were never definitively proven. Ariel Castro, In the early 2000s, the city of Cleveland witnessed one of the most horrifying kidnapping cases in modern American history. Ariel Castro, a man who presented a normal face to society in a series of calculated acts, abducted 3 young women, Michelle Knight, Amanda Berry, and Gina DeJesus, holding them captive in his home for over a decade. The victims were kept in unimaginable conditions in complete isolation. They were chained and subjected to relentless sexual and psychological abuse, to the point where they were forcibly impregnated on multiple occasions. But in May of 2013, a sudden opportunity for escape arose. Amanda Berry managed to attract the attention of a neighbor and, with his help, freed herself and the others. This event sent a deep shock through the community and captured the nation's attention. Castro was immediately arrested and sentenced to life imprisonment. However, just a few weeks into his sentence, he committed suicide in his cell. The house that was the scene of these prolonged atrocities was completely demolished by order of the authorities and turned into green space. Thorne. In July of 1960, a horrific tragedy swept across Australia, leading to a profound reevaluation of privacy laws. Thorne, an 8-year-old boy, vanished on his way to school. This event was directly linked to his parents' recent lottery win and the widespread publication of their names and exact address in the newspapers. A Hungarian immigrant named Stephen Bradley, who exploited this information, kidnapped the boy and demanded a large ransom. But this story had a tragic ending. Graham's body was found about 6 weeks later in a scrubland, and examinations revealed he had been murdered shortly after the abduction. The court sentenced Bradley to death, a penalty later commuted to life imprisonment. In the wake of this case, the laws governing the publication of lottery winners' information were seriously amended to protect individuals' privacy. Patty Hearst. In February of 1974, Patricia Hearst, the young heiress to the Hearst media empire, was kidnapped by a radical group, calling itself the Symbionese Liberation Army, or the SLA. This group, with its revolutionary motives, pressured her family to fund a massive statewide food distribution program for the needy. After weeks in captivity, something astonishing happened. Patricia Hearst appeared in a propaganda video announcing her solidarity with the SLA and taking the name Tanya, effectively joining the ranks of her very captors. This shift in allegiance created a national identity crisis, forcing the public to ask a fundamental question. Was she a victim of brainwashing, or had she willingly become a revolutionary? The case grew even stranger when footage emerged of her allegedly participating in an armed bank robbery. Finally, in 1975, she was captured and later convicted for her role in the robbery. However, her prison sentence was later commuted by President Jimmy Carter. Jacob Wetterling. In October of 1989, a horrific tragedy occurred in Minnesota that became a symbol of a national fear known as stranger danger. Jacob Wetterling, an 11-year-old boy, was riding his bike with his brother and a friend when they were suddenly confronted by a masked and armed man. The assailant chose only Jacob and took him away. This event triggered one of the longest and most painful missing persons cases in American history. For nearly 3 decades, Jacob's fate remained a mystery, and the case had a profound impact on American parenting culture. It ushered in what became known as an age of distrust, a time when children's freedom to play and roam was forever restricted. Finally, in 2016, after 27 long years, the truth was revealed. Danny Heinrich, the prime suspect in the case, in exchange for judicial immunity, confessed to abducting, assaulting, and murdering Jacob. He led authorities to a field near Painesville where the boy's remains were identified using dental records. Ursula Herrmann. In September of 1981, the community in Germany was confronted with one of the most tragic cases in its history. Ursula Herrmann, a 10-year-old girl who was riding her bicycle home, vanished. Her family soon received a ransom demand for 2 million German marks. They immediately agreed to pay, but this rescue attempt came far too late. Nearly 3 weeks after the abduction, her body was discovered in a forest near Egging, Bavaria. She had been placed inside a box that the kidnapper had prepared with a strange and obsessive attention to detail. It contained a warm blanket, food, a book, and even a radio for company. These items suggested the abductor's initial intention was to keep her alive. However, based on medical examinations, Ursula had most likely suffocated from a lack of oxygen just a few hours after being placed inside the box.